Welcome to another episode of Paladin Podcast. Today we're actually going to look at two books, but they're both related in that they are written by the same person. The first one is A Hope Circuit, which is written in 2019, is the biography of Martin Seligman, and he wrote another book earlier on called Learned Optimism. And so those are the two books. They're both related to optimistic thinking because the subtitle of Learned Optimism is How to Change Your Mind and Your Life. And the subtitle of The Hope Circuit is A Psychologist's Journey from Helplessness to Optimism. So there's kind of a theme here where he talks about his views of optimism in one book, and then he talks about how that worked out in his life in the later book. Okay, so my overall question for Dr. Seligman and for his two books are, is there or can Christianity compete with the optimism that Seligman is advocating? Okay, so that's kind of the question that we're looking at. But first, you might not even know who Martin Seligman is. He is not as famous as people like Sigmund Freud or B.F. Skinner or Carl Rogers or someone like that. But if you're in the field of psychology and you've been in the field of psychology for quite a while, you've heard of him, or at least you've heard of some of his experiments. The most famous experiment he did was a long, long time ago about learned helplessness, which is where he gets the title Learned Optimism. But learned helplessness was done on dogs. And briefly, you put this dog in a cage and you shock the floor, and then you provide a door. And so the dog runs around because he doesn't want to be shocked. He runs around, he finds the door, and he gets out. But then you shut the door. And what happens to the dog then? Well, the dog runs around trying to find a way out and eventually realizes that there is no way out. So he just settles down and accepts the fact that he's going to be shocked and probably killed. Then you open the door. So there's a way out now for this dog who's been shocked. And the interesting piece that Seligman discovered was that even when the door was opened, this dog had learned to be helpless. And so the dog wouldn't escape, even when there was an escape route. I guess I should apologize to those of you who are dog lovers, because that can be pretty traumatic. And those kind of experiments cannot be done now without huge amounts of paperwork. But anyway, what he learned was, and he applied this to humans, is that when we feel like there's no way out, that we learn to be pessimistic. And so there's a lot about, it's called learned helplessness. He thought that might have something to do with depression and things like that. But later on, based on that, he wondered if you can learn to be pessimistic, if you can learn to be helpless, could you possibly learn to be optimistic? And that's where his book, Learned Optimism, comes from. And I think that's an important point. He claims that psychology as a whole is based on removing bad things. You know, like if you're depressed, you want to be not depressed. If you were anxious, you want to be not anxious. But he says that psychology has kind of failed and dropped the ball because we don't hold out anything called a fulfilling life. We don't teach people how to be happy, in other words, which is quite an ambitious goal, actually, because psychology is based on pathology. And so Seligman tries to go on and actually apply what he's been saying. And he shifts from learned helplessness to learned optimism. Could you train yourself to be optimistic? And he makes a really interesting point, I think, in his first book, Learned Optimism, where he says that this is not just positive thinking. This is not where you look at the mirror every day and say, I'm beautiful and I'm wonderful and everybody should want to get to know me. It's not that. Instead of a positive thinking being a counterweight to negative thinking, what he advocates is just merely arguing with the negative thinking. In other words, it's enough when you think to yourself, everyone hates me, for example. That's a very pessimistic outlook. And Seligman would say, you don't have to say that everyone loves you. You just have to argue with the fact that everyone hates you. You have to discredit the negative. And that then will lay the groundwork for or provide momentum toward a positive approach towards life. which I thought was an interesting point because I've read all the articles and stuff, not all, but I've read much of the literature about positive thinking and positive self-image and telling yourself affirmations and things like that. And he doesn't seem to be talking like that. He would rather spend his time arguing with the negative thinking rather than advocating for positive. So what is this negative thinking? And we don't have time to go into all of it, but he says that we come up with an explanatory style that is consists of three characteristics. That how we respond to bad things, which is another aspect of learned helplessness, is how you respond to bad events, like the dog being shocked, right? And so how you respond is not with a positive affirmation, but rather the ability to argue with the negative affirmations. And what are some of those negative affirmations? Well, he says there are three that we latch onto that oftentimes lead to learned helplessness. Like, for example, if you believe that whatever happened to you is permanent. Some of my students sometimes don't get the grades that they want to get. And so if you believe that, well, I guess I'm never going to get a good grade, that can be kind of deflating and discouraging and lead to learned helplessness. So if you think that this event that just happened to you is just characteristic of many events and they're permanent and there's nothing you can do about it. Second is pervasive. In other words, it's not just that I failed this exam, but I'm going to fail all my exams and I'm just an idiot and I shouldn't be here in school anyway. Things like that, where the disappointment or the bad event becomes global. This person doesn't like me, therefore no one likes me. That kind of thing. And then the personalization, that's the third one. They all begin with P, which is kind of easy to remember. But the third one is personalization, that the bad things that happen to me are my fault. And so I really can't change much about this. As opposed to maybe I got a bad grade because the professor didn't grade my paper right. But instead of entertaining that option, I'm just going to quickly go to I got a bad grade because I'm stupid or I don't belong in college or something like that. So it's permanent, it's pervasive, and it's personalized. And Seligman would say that if your explanatory style consists of those three responses to negative events, then you're probably going to end up with something like learned helplessness. And so what he wants to do is argue with those things. It reminds me of, some of you might remember this, rational emotive therapy. It's very old, but the idea, the guy by the name of Ellis, but it was that you argue with the negative rather than promote the positive. So what is his way of arguing with the negative? Well, he mostly argues with the negative with a tool called cognitive psychology. And this gets into his book, his autobiography, because in his autobiography, he has lived long enough. He was actually the president of the American Psychological Association for a while. He's been at the University of Pennsylvania, right down the road from us here at Cairn, for many, many years. And so he has known many, many of the major players when it comes to psychology, especially in the field of cognitive behaviorism. He was a friend of the founder of cognitive behaviorism, for that matter. And so he's very much a fan of cognitive behavioral theory, that you can change how you think, and that how you think determines how you feel, which is a cardinal rule of cognitive behavioral theory. And so Seligman would say that cognitive behavioral therapy, or theory, is the cure for learned optimism. That if you can train yourself to be optimistic, or if you train yourself to be pessimistic, whether you've decided to do that or not, but rather it's just a matter of changing your thinking, which is in opposition to those of us on the other side. And again, I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but cognitive behaviorism is one theory of helping people. Another theory is psychodynamic, which is the grandson of Freudian theory. And psychodynamic gets into why you believe what you believe, where it came from, family history, those kinds of things, defense mechanisms, and a little bit more in depth in some sense. Whereas cognitive behavioral theory doesn't really care where you got those beliefs, it just teaches you how to change them. And so that's where Seligman falls down. He doesn't really care where you got the beliefs. He just wants to advocate that you can change them. It doesn't matter where you got them. And so that again is cognitive therapy, that you can change what you believe, and therefore look at life better. Now, what's interesting, that's all in Learned Optimism, which is the book he wrote 20 or 30 years ago. But what's interesting is in his biography, or his autobiography, written in 2018, which isn't that long ago, and he's looking back at his own life, he actually talks about how, he was, and this is all in his book, he was divorced, he cheated on his wife, he had strained relationships with his children, things like that. And then in his 40s or 50s or something like that, he met a graduate student and fell in love with her, and his life turned positive. He actually says that in the book, my life turned positive. And I remember thinking, well, of course it did. If you're in your 40s and 50s and you meet some 20-year-old really smart, really attractive woman who was willing to marry you, that is an incredibly positive event. And their marriage has lasted, so apparently they really do love each other and they're happy and all of that. I'm not arguing with any of that. I'm just saying that in his book, and I've read his autobiography, he doesn't seem to apply his own plan for being more optimistic. He rather was pessimistic most of his life until he met this young lady and married her, and that was the beginning of his ability and capacity to think in a more positive way. So I think he kind of is a little bit disingenuous there when he mentions that. But then back to my key question. If Seligman has a point that you can argue with the negative thoughts that you have and therefore live a more happier, more fulfilling life, is there anything that can Christianity offer anything like that? Can Christianity offer anything better than that? And I think that's the important question, is before we run down the road with Seligman and say, okay, teach me how to be happy, we have to ask ourselves, is that really what we want? Is there anything better out there? And the question about whether Christianity can offer a happy life or not, I would say yes in some ways, but no in others. The goal of the Christian life is not to feel better. The goal of the Christian life is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, which is the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And so there is an enjoyment there. There is a joy in life that we are supposed to embrace. But there's also a lot of grief and sadness because this world is not the way it's supposed to be. I am not the way I'm supposed to be. This world is broken. Romans 8, when you talk about the famous verse Romans 8:28, where God works everything out for good, in that same chapter he talks about all creation groans and we groan. And there's just a sense of life is not the way it's supposed to be. And if you look at life honestly and realistically, there is a lot that could lead to a sense of pessimism and maybe even cynicism. But of course, for Christianity, that's not the end of the story. So maybe in this life, there isn't a competition. But of course, we hold out for the next life. We hold out for one day when Jesus comes back and fixes all of this and takes away sin and removes all the external bad events that could trigger learned helplessness in us. That's kind of an interesting way to put it. I prefer to explain it theologically, but anyway, when Jesus comes back and fixes all of this and changes all of that, then we will be happy forever, because the biggest barrier to unhappiness is sin and living in a sinful world. And the assumption that you can talk your way out of a lot of those things, and that therefore leads to a happy life, eventually Seligman is going to pass from this world to the next, and all of us are going to die one day unless the Lord comes back. And so we have to face the fact that, what then? And I think Christianity provides a way of experiencing joy on the other side of that, recognizing that this life is not all there is. In fact, 1 Corinthians 15, I think, actually agrees with Seligman, where it says, if we only have Jesus in this life, we're miserable. And I think what that means is, if you're just living for this life, then you probably ought to follow Seligman's Learned Optimism, because you don't want to waste the only time you have to exist thinking pessimistically and cynically the whole time. That's a bummer. But if there's more to this life, then Christianity offers the better deal, because we get some joy in this life and ultimate joy in the life to come. And there's no way learned optimism can compare with that, because Seligman is still an evolutionist. He believes there's nothing on the other side of death. And while I've never met this man, I would be curious one day, because he's probably older. He is older than me. He's probably in his 70s or 80s by now. I'm curious. I wonder what Seligman would say now if I were to interview him and say, what do you think about your own death? How do you feel about that? Do you feel optimistic about that? So I think that learned optimism probably has a point in some cases, but there are some things that we just can't talk our way out of. I also think Jesus and the Bible in general supports other ways of looking at things besides cognitive behaviorism. In other words, I think Jesus wants us to get at the heart of what's going on and not just superficially try to change. I think there are reasons why we believe what we believe, and I think attacking those reasons oftentimes helps too, rather than just talking ourselves out of it illogically. Okay, so hopefully that's given you something to think about. It gave me a lot to think about as I was reading it. It's interesting when somebody who is famous for a psychological theory actually writes about their life. And I'm always fascinated, whether it's Freud or Skinner or Maslow or Carl Rogers, or now in this case, Marty Seligman, where does their life live out what they claim is the way to happiness? Okay, so hopefully you've enjoyed this. We'll see you next time.